I've made this film for the descendants of Mark Neros and Eleni Pitiris. Most of us want to know where we have come from and the world our ancestors lived in. Where we are going is uncertain, but the more one knows about oneself and the lessons of the past, the greater the ability to steer a path into the unknown future. The world has changed slowly but dramatically since Mark and Eleni were born, and it will change even more dramatically in the future, but much more quickly. I will outline the genetic origins of Mark and Eleni and the different paths our ancestors took out of Africa. From my research, it appears our roots in Cyprus go very deep. In Eleni's case, perhaps all the way back to the first Neolithic settlements and Neolithic farmers 12,000 years ago. On Mark's side, our origins are via Central Asia and Europe and Cro-Magnon hunter-gatherers, and then probably to Cyprus via the region around the ancient city of Troy. Now, in 2010, the looks and characteristics of Mark and Helen are clearly apparent in their great-grandchildren. My DNA has been analysed to show the paths my maternal and paternal ancestors took out of Africa. Modern humans first appeared in Africa around 200,000 years ago. All of us alive today have a common female ancestor dating back about 150,000 years in Africa. All males outside of Africa share a common male ancestor in Africa dating back about 60,000 years. There are signs in Israel that humans crossed grasslands out of Africa into the Middle East 130,000 years ago. However, climate changed again. The deserts returned, the people were cut off, and eventually they died out. Around 70,000 years ago, low sea levels allowed humans to cross the lower part of the Red Sea into Arabia and followed the coast, eventually all the way to Australia. Another group, our ancestors, went north into the Middle East. Eleni's earliest known direct ancestor is a woman in Syria 12,000 years ago. Mark's ancestors were in Central Asia 45,000 years ago, then north and west into Europe 30,000 years ago. His ancestors were the Cro-Magnons. There was no human habitation on Cyprus before 10,000 BC. Much of the island at that time was covered with oak woodlands and spreading cedar trees. 8 to 10,000 years later, most of the trees were chopped down to build ships to fight the many wars which would have come to the region. The only animals that flourished on the island before humans came were pig-sized pygmy hippos and elephants. Full-sized elephants and hippos had swum to the Cyprus shore when the sea was much lower during the ice ages. In the absence of predators, evolution turned them to dwarfs. They became extinct probably because of climate change before humans arrived 10,000 years ago. Their bones are found along with the first signs of humans in the floor of Atacremnos cave in Akrotiri. It is thought that a change to a cold, dry climate with a loss of their wild gardens and lower sea levels led to Neolithic hunter-gatherers to new sites in Cyprus. However, things were no better on the island and they disappeared. Nearly 2,000 years passed before humans returned, this time better prepared with seed grain, wild pigs and wild goats to stock the island. At Myluthkia, what may be the oldest known wells in the world, dated about 8,000 BC, have been discovered. In the wells were found stone tools, goat and human bones, and domestic wheat and barley. Running wild today in the mountains of Cyprus, one can still see the descendants of the wild goats that were brought by the Neolithic farmers. These are the mouflon, a subspecies of wild sheep. Two other Neolithic settlements, dated about that time in Cyprus, have also been found. They have circular stone and mud brick dwellings, such as at Kirokitia. On the basis of similar architecture and stone tools, it has been proposed that these first farmers on Cyprus had originated from Western Syria. DNA studies show that Eleni's oldest relative existed at that time in Syria. It may be that Eleni's ancestors were in that group of Neolithic farmers who also took agriculture into Europe. This figurine from that time depicts a young woman in short top and miniskirt. The Archaeological Museum in Cyprus shows the progression and increasing sophistication through to the Bronze Age period, 2500 to 1050 BC. Copper was abundantly available in Cyprus, and this brought it into contact with its larger and more powerful neighbours, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and the Aegean peoples of Crete and Mycenae. In 1500 BC, Thutmose III, perhaps the greatest of all Egyptian pharaohs, included Cyprus in his domain. Around 1000 BC, the Phoenician merchants were spreading their alphabet around the Mediterranean. The Greek alphabet was a direct successor. Around 1600 BC, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history occurred on Thera in Crete, and may have resulted in the downfall of the Minoan civilization. Mycenaeans then became masters of the Aegean world, and Cyprus became a major Mycenaean commercial outpost. About 1230 BC, many Mycenaeans fled Greece, where their cities had been destroyed. New colonists brought the Greek language to Cyprus. Legend refers to the foundations of kingdoms in Cyprus by Greek heroes of the Trojan War. In the 11th century BC, Cyprus was Hellenized. It became a wealthy country where Cypriot islanders and the Greek colonists coexisted peacefully and mixed their languages and culture. The Greeks became acquainted with the goddess Aphrodite. She was the goddess of love and desire, and Greek mythology has Aphrodite born in the sea foam near Paphos, where she had been worshipped from the early Iron Age around 1000 BC. The history of Cyprus during the first millennium BC is that of the struggle between the cultural Cypro-Greek heritage and the influence coming from the Orient through the Phoenicians. Around 900 BC, the Phoenicians established a strong commercial centre in Cyprus to control the copper mines. They exported the copper to the Aegean. At the end of the 8th century BC, Assyria conquered Cyprus, but its rule was not too oppressive. The kings of Cyprus kept their power, and Cyprus flourished, and eventually became independent and prosperous for a century. In 570 BC, Cyprus was conquered by the Egyptian king Amasis, whose rule was oppressive. After 25 years, the Egyptians gave Cyprus over to the Persians, who were merciless oppressors and dominated Cyprus for 200 years. During the 4th and 5th centuries BC, the Cypriots fought against the Persian occupation, and the pro-Greek kings adopted Greek democracy and the Greek way of life and art. Persian rule over Cyprus eventually weakened, and when Alexander the Great led his expedition to the east, the Cypriot kings supported him, and Cyprus became part of his empire in 332 BC. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his successors coveted the island for its wealth in copper and timber and started wars again. Finally, the island came under the domination of the Ptolemies of Egypt, who used the island as a military outpost. Cyprus remained under the Ptolemies for 2.5 centuries. The power of the kings of Egypt on the island was undermined by the kings of Syria, and their rivalries gave the Romans the opportunity to intervene and eventually to make Cyprus a Roman province in 50 BC. Roman rule was oppressive, and the Romans exploited the wealthy resources of Cyprus. Most of the remnants of antiquity that one can see in Cyprus today date back to the Roman period. The Roman period was also the time of introduction of Christianity. In 45 AD, St. Paul landed at Salamis in order to preach to the Jewish community, which was numerous in Cyprus at the time. St. Paul was accompanied by St. Barbarus. He was a native of Salamis and a member of the Cypriot Jewish community. The Roman proconsul at Paphos was converted to Christianity after he witnessed a miracle attributed to St. Paul. He became the first Roman governor anywhere to be converted to Christianity. It took nearly 4 centuries for the island to become Christian. The remarkable fact about these first centuries is that the two cultures, pagan and Christian, coexisted without clashes. However, in 115 AD, the Jews started rebellions in Egypt and Palestine, as well as Cyprus. They are said to have killed all the non-Jewish inhabitants of Salamis, about 200,000 in number. The rebellion was suppressed by the Romans, and the Jews were all expelled from Cyprus. In 330 AD, Cyprus became ruled by Greek governors sent from Constantinople, and the Roman administrators left. This was the start of the Byzantine period, which lasted till 1191 AD. In this time, Greek culture developed more freely with Christianity. Churches and monasteries, filled with art and treasure, and the strong influence of the church in Greek society became firmly established and persist in Cyprus to this day. However, few remnants of this rich period are left, as in the mid-7th century, Arabs invaded the eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus. Inspired by their prophet Muhammad, they pillaged cities and churches and massacred large numbers of Cypriots. Arab occupation lasted 30 years before a treaty was made with the Byzantine emperor, whereby they shared the island and its revenues for 3 centuries. In 691 AD, the Byzantine emperor Justinian II transplanted the whole of the island's population to Propontis in Anatolia. A coin minted by Justinian in 563 AD has been found in Balakhori, the hometown of Eleni Pititis. The name Balakhori is derived from the Greek Balia Choria, meaning old villages. This refers to 2 separate villages existing on the eastern side of the Troodos Ranges in Cyprus, dating back to the Byzantine period in the 1st millennium AD. There are no written references to Balakhori in the Byzantine period, which ended in 1191 with the conquest of Cyprus by the Crusaders. Written evidence of the existence of Balakhori is also scarce during the Frankish period, 1192 to 1489. It is during the Venetian occupation, 1489 to 1570, that references to Balakhori become more frequent. Suleiman the Magnificent ended Venetian rule in Cyprus when the Ottomans invaded in 1570. The native Cypriots offered no resistance to the invaders because of their hatred of their Italian oppressors. Yet again, the Cypriot people found they had exchanged a bad master for an even worse one. Ottoman rule lasted until 1878, when the British took control and made it a military base. Cyprus was very peacefully handed over to the British by the Turks. The Cypriots were happy about the change hoping for liberty and progress to come, finally freed from the oppressive and corrupt rule. But the island was miserable and depopulated. There are only 186,000 inhabitants, with a ratio of 9 Greeks to 3 Turks. The British gave Cyprus a constitution with a legislative council of 9 Greeks and 3 Turks. They tried hard to fairly administer the island and built roads, dams and hospitals. This is the Cyprus that Mark was born into, and he always maintained great respect for the British. Mark's father, Niarchos Papadopoulos, was born in 1872 and lived till he was 88. He was the first school teacher in Agros and was highly respected as a community member. Niarchos' wife, Lucia Michail, was born in Agros in 1878, the year that Britain took control of Cyprus from the Turks. They had 12 children, 4 of whom emigrated to Australia: Mark, Melis, Con and Venice. Their eldest son Mark was born in 1899. He was in his teens when Cyprus was annexed by the British at the outbreak of the war with the Ottoman Empire in 1914. He grew up in a time of terrible war and uncertainty for the future. Mark was educated as an accountant and ran a shoe store in Limassol, but business there had little future. There was also unrest between the Greeks and the Turks on the island, and during the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, Mark decided he had no real future there and left for South Africa in 1923. This photo of Mark, sitting on the left, was taken early in 1924 in Port Said in Egypt. He was heading for South Africa after leaving Cyprus. He met up with compatriots heading for Australia. He obtained passage on the Italian cargo ship, the Principessa Giovanna, and arrived in Australia in March 1924. Here he is in North Queensland, shortly after he arrived. The photo is taken in Mariba, and on the right is Chris Malonis, whose nephew Lucas had convinced Mark to come to Australia in Port Said. Mark was born Niarchos Papadopoulos. He anglicised his name to Mark Neros when he applied for a passport to South Africa under the British administration. In 1934, Eleni also arrived in Australia, 11 years after Mark. She was a 16-year-old Cypriot girl from Ballyhorrie, a mountain village next to Mark's village of Agros. She came to Australia to live with her brother Peter on his sugarcane farm at Home Hill in North Queensland. By that time, Cyprus was a British colony, and Eleni travelled on a British passport. Her passport shows her born in Ballyhorrie in 1918 and shows her occupation as a seamstress. She recalled many years later that she did some training as a dressmaker but didn't like it. Her new life was to start when she arrived in Fremantle in August 1934. Eleni was the youngest of 11 children. She was born in Ballyhorrie but grew up in Nicosia since the age of 2 years. She was raised by her 2 eldest sisters. This photo, taken in 1930, shows Eleni with her parents and sister Angeliki, who died in Sydney in 2009, aged 95. Eleni, in a blue pleated skirt, was 12 when this photo was taken. Her mother, Maria Metochi, died in 1941. Maria's father's name was Christophoros Metochi, and her mother's name was Angeliki. Eleni's father was Nikolas Pidiris. He was a wine merchant in Ballyhorrie. He died early 1940s, blind when he fell and broke his spine. He was in his 80s. Nikolas was a strict father. he would not allow Eleni to cut her hair. When she got to Port Said in Egypt, Eleni cut her hair, had her photo taken and sent it to her father. In Australia, she had her brothers Chris, Peter and Thamianos to look after her. With her short hair, she was a liberated 16-year-old. However, her life was far from comfortable. She lived in a tin shed in the heat and humidity of North Queensland, fearful of snakes on the roof. Eleni's brother, Chris, came to Australia in 1923, aged 20, and within 3 years had bought a cane farm in Home Hill. He married in 1936 and Eleni was bridesmaid. Mark was best man, so he and Eleni met for the first time. As was the custom, Mark told Eleni's brother Chris that he was very impressed with Eleni and would like to marry her. Eleni agreed to the proposal and they were soon married in the Greek Orthodox Church in Brisbane. Eleni could never have imagined that 70 years later a granddaughter with the same name as her mother would also wear this dress at her wedding. Mark and Eleni went to Surfers Paradise for their honeymoon, a very quiet seaside village at the time. Young Eleni had married a man much older than her who was not in good health. Mark had found work when he first arrived in Australia as a timber cutter in Gordonvale. He became very ill with pneumonia. After he recovered, his good friend Chris Malonis helped him out, and Mark worked for Chris in his cafe in Gordonvale. He got experience running a cafe business. Because of continuing health problems, doctors recommended he go to a drier climate. Chris Manros sought a new partner in a cafe business which was struggling during the Depression in Dalby. Mark and Chris became partners in Cafe Majestic and established a partnership which would last for the rest of their lives. Mark was devoted to his new business and it started to flourish. He brought out 3 of his brothers, Con, Melis and Venice, and a nephew, Nick, from Cyprus to work in the cafe. Mark had recipes, still written in this little notebook, for the great variety of handmade sweets that he offered. They were made in the back of the cafe. Apart from the neatly dressed waitresses, Eleni was the only woman amongst all those men. They all lived in a small house behind the cafe, so life totally revolved around the business. Before long, Eleni was pregnant with her first child. Her young brothers-in-law pampered her with strawberries and cream and ice cream, and she soon put on quite a bit of weight. When Chris was born, they continued to live above the shop. When World War II started, Con, Melis, Venice and Nick were called up. Mark and Chris Manros found it impossible to cope with the demands of business. After considering various options, they decided to close the cafe and turn it into a grocery shop. When they opened, selling groceries, cigarettes, drinks and small goods, business was brisk and easier to handle than the cafe. It was such a success that they continued to operate a supermarket for many years after the war. During the war, Mark established himself in the community as a reliable, respectable, hard-working, honest citizen. Helen also integrated very well into the community and by the end of the war had 3 children, Chris, Nick and Andrew, and a nice new home in the street behind the shops, facing the Mile Creek. Mark had purchased a large parcel of land and built 4 new homes in that prime area of town. He also bought more adjoining shops. After the war, she became pregnant with her 4th child, John. There was quite a large gap between him and his older brothers, but then the fifth boy, Peter, came along in the mid-50s with an even larger age gap. Mark's three brothers, Nellis, Con and Venice, had also married Greek girls, and the family multiplied rapidly to create a large extended family which embraced the Australian way of life, but retained the qualities of their Greek Cypriot heritage. Mark and his brothers had carved out a wonderful new life in their new country. In the meantime, the problems they left behind in Cyprus continued.
On July 20th, Turkey invaded Cyprus. Mr. Ecevit, the Turkish Prime Minister, describes the invasion as a simple peace operation aimed at restoring the status quo. Within 3 days, a ceasefire is called. The Greek junta collapses and Greece returns to democracy. Samson resigns and is replaced by Glafkos Clearidis as acting president. A conference is held at Geneva, but it disintegrates when the Turks, abandoning their peace operation line, demand territorial changes on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. On August 14th, Turkey attacks again. Mr. Ecevit publicly thanks the United States for their support. In a fever of anti-Americanism, Greece withdraws from NATO. The third guarantor power, Britain, with air force and troops on the spot, sticks to her policy of strict non-involvement. Unopposed, the Turkish planes wreak havoc in towns and villages. Napalm bombs burn forests and civilians, and the roads fill with refugees who flee from their homes in terror. Within 3 days, the Attila Line, as the Turks chose to call it, has slashed Cyprus in two.
In 1975, exactly 1 year after the Turkish invasion, Mark and Helen returned to Cyprus for the first time. Mark and Eleni's descendants, who have grown up in Australia, are largely detached from the lingering resentment between the two Cypriot communities. The causes lie deep in the past, which Mark and Eleni chose to leave far behind.